Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sally Whipple. I'm the director of Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm happy to welcome you today for a conversation at noon where every month we explore historical topics with a current events twist. Connecticut's Old State House is one of the many important Connecticut sites on the Connecticut Women's Heritage Trail, which is sponsored by the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. Some of the women connected to this particular site are Hannah Watson, who was the publisher of the Connecticut Current during the Revolutionary War. Today we know that as the Hartford Current. This is also a place that was important in the story of our state heroine, Prudence Crandall, and Emily Seymour Goodwin Holcomb was a woman who was instrumental in saving and preserving the Old State House. I urge you to travel the trail, the Women's Heritage Trail, and visit this and other sites to learn more about the Connecticut women who affected change in our state. Governor Ella Grasso did not work in this building, but she did add greatly to a long and strong tradition of politically active women in Connecticut, and no doubt inspired the interests and careers of many. And we're so pleased that now there's a new book about Governor Grasso that can inspire even more people. Now Diane Smith and today's guests will help us explore Governor Grasso's life and legacy. Diane is the Connecticut Network's senior producer for program development. She's been honored as a journalist, author, video producer, and she has been honored as an unofficial, but very effective ambassador of Connecticut. Please join me in welcoming Diane, who will introduce our distinguished guests.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. This is the book that we're here to talk about today, although I should point out that one of our panelists, Susan Bysiewicz, wrote a book a number of years ago that she has reprinted on her own story about Ella Grasso. So we have two experts on Ella Grasso in the room today, and very happy about that. This is John Purmont's new book, and to introduce John, I thought I would actually just read to you something from the flap, and it goes like this. When Ella Grasso ran for governor of Connecticut in 1974, she had not lost an election since she was first voted into the state's General Assembly in 1952. Think about that. The people of Connecticut chose her to be the nation's first woman elected as governor in her own right, which was a capstone to a long and successful career devoted to public service, effective government, and the democratic process. During her tenure as governor, Grasso's leadership was tested in the face of fiscal problems, state layoffs, and budget shortfalls. The daughter of Italian immigrants, she endeared herself to constituents during the Great Blizzard of 1978 when she stayed at the State Armory around the clock to direct emergency operations. John Purmont was there, working right by her side, serving as Grasso's executive assistant. In his book, John draws on his diary from the time, research into Grasso's archives, and interviews with Grasso's family and friends to give us this intimate portrait of a political pioneer. John Purmont is an emeritus professor of history at Southern Connecticut State University, where he taught for 17 years. He taught courses in Connecticut history, colonial U.S. history, and he coordinated the teacher education program for the SCSU History Department. His 13-year career in state government included serving in various administrative positions under two governors, Ella Grasso and William O'Neill. He is also city historian for West Haven. Please welcome John Purmont.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane, and thanks to the Old State House staff, Sally Whipple, an old friend of mine, and Rebecca Tabor-Conover for planning this meeting today. I'm glad to see you all. I'm glad to see so many people remember Ella Grasso, and it's nice to realize that as I go around the state of Connecticut, she has not been forgotten. And while engaged in the research and writing of this book, I tried very hard to learn a few things about her that I didn't previously know. And I wondered what the sources were of Ella's strength and her resolve to seek a career in public service, politics, at a time when few women chose that profession. I asked myself, what were the decisive factors in her life that enabled her to reach the pinnacle of elective office in the state of Connecticut. My position, as I'm going to talk about it today, is I suggest it was her strong educational background, her experiences there, and what emanated from that, the opportunities that she had that were vitally important to her success. Integral to her education was one component which played a convincing and persuasive role. It was a network of supportive, encouraging women, truly role models, whom she encountered in school and who helped to provide substance and direction to the career path she chose. Now, let me be clear. I taught for many years, and students were always saying, well, can you clarify that a bit for us? I want to be very clear at the outset here today. There are always numerous factors that help to fashion and shape people's lives. In the governor's case, her intellectual brilliance. She was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Mount Holyoke College. She graduated 5th in her class. She was a hard worker. She was diligent. She had a terrific work ethic. I can tell you about that. She was committed to serving others. She had tremendous political smarts. And her partnership with John Bailey was, of course, legendary here in Connecticut politics. All of those factors were vital to her success, no question. For our purposes today, however, I will focus on the individuals who were influential in helping a young Ella Tambusi Grasso pursue a remarkable career in public service. I suggest that a female support network, similar to the Old Boys Network, you've heard of that one. We don't hear about female support networks, but historians are doing a little bit more with that these days. That was of influential and sustaining component which led to the world of public affairs. The political world once described by the late Connecticut Congressman Stuart McKinney as a world of sharks often erected barriers to discourage women from entering what was seen as a world reserved for men. Eleanor Roosevelt offered advice to women interested in entering politics. She was quite blunt. Those of us who remember seeing her on television, she never was at a loss for words. She said what women needed to do who were interested in getting into politics was to get into the game and stay in it and develop skin as tough as rhinoceros hide, and to play the game as men do. There's no doubt Ella heeded those suggestions. Ironically, Ella Tambusi's birth, May 10th, 1919, coincided with congressional approval and eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. The following year, 4 women entered the House of Representatives in Hartford at the state legislature. 4. And that was the first time, of course, women were in those legislative bodies. That doesn't seem so long ago, 1920. That was the legislative body, the House of Representatives, where the Windsor Locks native would start her political career in 1953. Her election as a state legislator commenced a 28-year career in politics, never marred by defeat. It was a profession she set her sights on due to the influence of 2 important women in her life. One, a nun, Sister de Chantal, who taught Ella in the 8th grade at St. Mary's School in Windsor Locks. And I learned recently when I was up in Windsor Locks that the school is no longer in business. I think it's now senior citizen apartments. And the other one was Professor Amy Hughes, her advisor at Mount Holyoke College. From both educators, she drew inspiration to strive for excellence and to pursue a career in politics where few women had ever ventured. Sister de Chantal, Ella said, encouraged me to do my thing, whatever it might be. And she added that in 1930, the nun was truly a modern woman. She believed each of her charges had a special talent. And as Ella explained, she encouraged us, girls and boys, to develop those skills. The devout nun's words of encouragement never faded from Ella Grasso's mind, and she left a remarkable lasting impression on Connecticut's future governor. She reminded her 8th grade students that each of them had a very special gift, and it was something we could do better, whether it was woodworking or working with machinery. You had to develop your potential. I love that theory, and I've always tried to do my best, she said. Further, Ella noted that Sister de Chantal instilled in her students the idea that they had an obligation to develop that quality because that's why they'd been born. Ella, the only child of Italian immigrants, frequently referred to her 8th grade teacher as the most remarkable woman I've ever met. And she named her one of 5 women she most admired. The others were her own mother, Maria Tambusi, St. Teresa, Madame Curie, and Margaret Mead. And she often said about Madame Curie, she said, I wanted to be another Madame Curie when I was growing up, but she said, I never did well in science, and I still don't. So there went the hope for a career as a Madame Curie number 2. I would venture a guess that few of us in this room would remember with such clarity what our 8th grade teachers told us that may have inspired us. Ella's friendship with her elementary school teacher continued for decades, a remarkable achievement in itself. Sister de Chantal advised and counseled Ella until the nun's death during Ella's 3rd term as Secretary of the State in the late 1960s. The second woman in Ella's female support network was Professor Amy Hughes, a faculty member at Mount Holyoke College. She was there from 1905 to 1943. Ella met her during her freshman year, and she became Ella's mentor, her academic advisor, counselor, whom Ella noted opened the windows of my mind to a new and exciting world. Amy Hughes received her Ph.D. in 1903 from the University of Chicago, and I would venture to say there were probably maybe a dozen women, if that, who received their Ph.D. in 1903. It was a remarkable achievement. Ella's words about Professor Hughes struck me because she said she was a vigorous activist, a respected scholar in economics and labor history, who also served as executive secretary of the Massachusetts Minimum Wage Committee, the first in the nation. She taught classes in the economics and sociology department that emphasized bringing problems of the working world into her classroom. It was typical of Professor Hughes to introduce students to the real world of working women who toiled in the mills, factories, and industrial plants in the Holyoke, Massachusetts area. Through her efforts, Mount Holyoke students, including Ella, learned at first hand the realities of daily work in dirty, grimy conditions where women earned low wages. Practical educational learning experiences outside the classroom were characterized by Ella as living laboratories, and she credited Professor Hughes for whetting my appetite for public affairs. One day when I was reviewing Professor Hughes' papers, I discovered a letter tucked away in a dirty file at the archives at Mount Holyoke College. It was a copy of Amy Hughes' letter, a recommendation, written on Ella's behalf. Ella Tambusi, she wrote, was a young woman who would have a bright and successful future with a decided capacity for leadership. After Ella graduated in 1940, it was Miss Hughes who invited Ella to be the graduate assistant in the economics and sociology department. During the next 2 years, Ella completed studies for an MA degree, which she received in 1942. Their friendship and mutual admiration continued for many years until Miss Hughes' death in 1970 at 92 years of age ended that close and remarkable friendship. There's little doubt Ella Tambusi Grasso's years of academic study at Mount Holyoke inspired and impacted this Windsor Locks native in a great many ways, too numerous probably to go through today. Ella emphasized that conclusion in an address that she gave at a commencement ceremony at Mount Holyoke College in June of 1975. And this was a few months after she'd become the governor of Connecticut. Remember, she became governor in January of 1975. She told that graduating class that at Mount Holyoke, I was taken seriously, first as a student and then as a teaching assistant and graduate student. There were many models to emulate on the faculty and the administration and among the speakers invited to our campus. Among many who spoke at the South Hadley campus was Anna Rosenberg, an advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt, Frances Perkins, a Mount Holyoke graduate, the first Secretary of Labor female, first female appointed to a presidential cabinet, Dame Moira Hess. And I can tell you a little bit about Dame Moira Hess. I used to take piano lessons when I was taught, and there was a picture of a woman on the piano that my piano teacher had. And I said, "Who's that lady staring at me in that photo?" And she said, "That's Dame Moira Hess." You know, it's like obeisance had to be the next step because Dame Moira Hess had that worldwide reputation as a pianist, classical pianist. Actress Catherine Cornell. Ella mentions her many times as someone she was quite impressed with. And historian Mary Beard. Mary Beard's husband, Charles Beard, wrote a scathing review of President Roosevelt's administration. One is struck, she said, with the visibility of women on the faculty, on the campus as guests of the college, functioning as what we know to be role models today. Here, she said, I was encouraged to think of my life not as something that would happen to me, but as something I would shape for myself. We were encouraged in the view that to share a passion for helping others was a joy and not a drudgery. She went on to emphasize, we did not question, indeed we were not concerned about whether females were capable and equal to males. Our potential was so much taken for granted that it did not have to be discussed or defended. Finally, this trailblazing woman, the first Mount Holyoke graduate to serve as a member of Congress, the first woman in American history to become governor, who did not succeed her husband in office, and clearly Connecticut's first woman governor, she reminded the graduating seniors that she remembered the stirring words of Jeanette Marks, who was a member of the Mount Holyoke College community. She wasn't on the teaching staff, but she was well known in an administrative. She was an administrator. Ms. Marks, Ella recalled, wrote a farewell letter to Ella's graduating class in 1940. It was published in the Mount Holyoke News, the college newspaper. Ms. Marks wrote that there was, for women, greater opportunity to serve than women had ever known. Now, this is 1940. In one memorable phrase, which I believe the governor took to heart, I never had the chance to ask her about it, unfortunately, but Ms. Marks urged the seniors to become applied students of public affairs, refusing to use our influence by deputy. When I first saw that phrase, I reread it, and I said, there it is. That's the kernel of where her resolve came from, by listening to those words, which, of course, added to what she had come across in her years there at Mount Holyoke. She was there for 6 years. That challenge, placed before Ella and her classmates, resonated with the future governor. The career path she chose left little doubt that she accepted that challenge and successfully pursued a fulfilling life in public service, the world of politics, achieving a record of distinctive service and strong leadership. The governor explained it this way, and I found this phrase in a letter she wrote to a professor up at AIC, American International College in Springfield. He had written to her asking her to answer some questions in a questionnaire. And he said, what were your dreams, your ambitions, and all of that kind of thing? And she said the following, and I quote, "I am so glad I grew up to live and to serve. And like the battered warrior, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." Thank you.
We're going to give you an opportunity to ask some questions now. We have some panelists joining us. Would the panelists please come up? And
remind you that we do have these books for sale at the back of the room if you're interested in purchasing one. I think that was a very inspirational talk, and I have to say it reminds me of growing up in Connecticut with Ella Grasso as governor and not even realizing that that was something unusual, but thinking that was a normal thing for a woman to do. And I think that's a great legacy that she has left, and it's going to be wonderful to explore that legacy now.
Thank you, Sally. Actually, John had a lovely turn of phrase in the book. I've always heard Ella remarked upon as the first woman governor who was governor in her own right. John puts it much better. He says, the first lady governor who was not first lady first, meaning all the female governors who preceded her had succeeded their husbands in office. And I thought that was just terrific. A couple of statistics for you. Since the November 2012 election, there are now 73 women in the House and 17 in the U.S. Senate. That's just 17% of House membership, and that ties women's legislative representative, the U.S., with Turkmenistan, 78th in the world. 5 of the 50 governors in the U.S. are female, and 24 states have never had a female governor, including the big dogs, California, New York, and Florida. So we're doing pretty well here in Connecticut, which is ranked in the top 10 in the percentage of women winning legislative seats in 2012, but still less than 1/3 of our lawmakers in Connecticut are women. And that's one of the reasons we asked our panel to join us today. I probably don't really need to introduce Susan Bysiewicz, but let me do that anyway. Susan is counsel with Pastor and Daly, in case you've been wondering what she's been doing lately. Her practice focuses on corporate law and finance, banking, securities, and commercial transactions. Prior to joining the firm, Susan was the Secretary of the State of Connecticut from 1999 to 2011, in fact, following closely there in Ella Grasso's footsteps. Prior to that, Ms. Bysiewicz served as state rep for the 100th District, representing Middletown, Durham, and Middlefield. And as I showed you briefly before, while she was attending law school, she wrote a book, Ella, a biography of Governor Ella Grasso. So thank you so much for joining us. Seated next to Susan is Gail Lavielle. Gail was elected to Connecticut's House of Representatives in 2010 to represent the 143rd District. That includes most of Wilton, the eastern part of Norwalk, and part of Westport, west of the Saugatuck River. She's a ranking member of the General Assembly's Commerce Committee and a member of the Appropriations, Education, and Higher Education Committees. And also, we're very happy to have Moira Lyons, also a first in state government, the first and I guess the only female Speaker of the House. Moira is the former state rep from Stamford and Speaker of the House. She now works as Director of Community and Government Relations for Norwalk Community College. She served as House Speaker from 1999 through 2005. Prior to that, Moira was the House Majority Leader, and she's won many awards for her government service, including Good Housekeeping Magazine, which named her one of the outstanding women in government. So I want to run all this by you, run this by all of you, since except for John, you've all served in the legislature. Ella described her first 2 years in the legislature as sheer bliss. Does that ring a bell with any of the three of you? Susan?
We're all laughing. we're all laughing because I'm sure we all had the experience of really wanting the job and then getting there and figuring out what a morass everything was. And I think we're also chuckling because we all, despite the fact that it was a crazy experience, probably all would say that being a state representative was a wonderful job. Next to being Secretary of the State, it was the best job I ever had.
Sheer bliss, Gail?
Well, I don't think anything is ever sheer bliss. But there is one point that we don't talk about enough, which is when you sit in that chamber and you realize that you are not you, but you are 24,000 people. You are speaking for 24,000 people. It really strikes you right here. I just hit the microphone. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
But it does, and that's the force of the impact. It's quite an honor. And I was in the private sector for 26 years, and the import of what you're doing for 24,000 and more individuals is really something. So I think that's not to be denied. It's a wonderful experience.
Moira, I know that your road through the legislature and your time as majority leader and speaker were so smooth that I'm sure that was nothing but blissful.
No, obviously it wasn't, but I have to say this, that when I was first elected, I'd only moved to Connecticut. I'm not a Connecticut native, so I'd only moved to Connecticut about a year and a half. And I found the first 2 years, I'll be honest with you, terribly intimidating. I wasn't familiar with the legislature. I didn't know what the legislative process was. I did not know anyone at all. I didn't even know the other representatives from Stamford. So to me, it was very much a learning process. And the reason I say that, it's important for all, particularly females, to recognize I didn't know a thing, and yet because of much help from my other colleagues and because of due diligence, which I think women do, I got to be Speaker of the House, knowing probably little or nothing when I first got there, other than I wanted to be a good representative and be the voice of the people.
And I guess I would just add one thing as I think about your question, Diane. I think what Ella Grasso meant when she said sheer bliss, one of the great things, and I think one of the reasons that we had enjoyed being in the legislature is that you saw how your time, your talents, your efforts made a difference for your constituents. And unfortunately, that's a very addictive thing for those of us in public service, because when you see how what you do can help other people, you want to do more of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Ella meant.
And John, Ella called it the noblest profession to be in public service. And yet so many of our public servants today are chastised and castigated for every little thing.
Yeah. I was going to say in response to the prior question, name me a politician that doesn't overstate things. You know? I mean, I said in the book after I quoted her, I said, but how was that possible? She was a lowly freshman. They didn't have staff. They didn't have interns in those days. She just churned out, went to the old machine and churned out mimeograph press releases, and she was just a firebrand about that. But, you know, it's difficult, I think, for women, particularly in her time, to have gotten where she got, but she had that inner conviction, that strength of character that was with her right from the beginning when she undertook this mission in public service. And I think it really stemmed from her role models that she saw and worked with at Mount Holyoke. I think that was a very large reason for her success.
Susan, I'd like you to talk a little bit about, because I think you probably know more about Ella than anybody in the room except for John, because of writing your book. Tell me a little bit about her style of governance, and was it particularly feminine in any way?
You know, it was interesting because I think there was a tremendous dichotomy, because on the one hand, she could be Mother Ella. She could be extremely maternal. So here's an example. The legislature was considering a bill that would mandate people who were riding motorcycles wear helmets. And so a lot of the motorcycle enthusiasts got very upset. And so they decided they were going to make a motorcycle ride to the Capitol and go visit with the governor. So you can imagine these big guys wearing the leather jackets, and they zoom into the Capitol. And, of course, the state troopers were a little bit leery about letting them in. And so Governor Grasso said, "Oh, no, by all means, bring them into my office." And so she sat them all down in her office, and they're starting to get sheepish. And she said, "Oh, my goodness, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so worried about you. I want you to wear helmets because otherwise you might hurt yourselves." And they all just kind of filed meekly out. Now, so that was the Mother Ella stuff. But on the other hand, there are other people, especially some of the gentlemen in the old boys' political network, who would tell you that, she could cuss like a truck driver and be very explicit about it. And, when it was, the time called for her to be very tough, she could do that too. And I think another thing that John has sort of alluded to, she had sort of two different lives. And she could easily move from Windsor Locks and her immigrant background to places like Mount Holyoke or Litchfield or Greenwich. It didn't matter. Wherever you dropped her down in the state of Connecticut, she could be comfortable and talk to any person that crossed her path. And I think that was the hallmark of her style. She was very comfortable in her own skin, and she could relate to everybody in Connecticut.
Moira, that strikes me as something that every politician really needs to cultivate if it doesn't come naturally to you, whether you're a man or a woman, that you have to be comfortable. This is a state with all sorts of diversity, ranging from, the population, the type of people that we are, where we come from, our income. I mean, just an incredibly diverse population.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I would call it, you have to be a people person who can easily move from one area to the next to talk to various people, because we have a very diverse population, even though we're a small state within Connecticut. I also think, following up on what Susan said about Ella Grasso, as you move up to leadership, and I know our other legislators would agree, you have to have those both sides of the coin. You have to be able to relate very well to your constituents, but we're in the legislature, and I'll speak for myself, you have to be really tough when you're dealing with some of the issues and some of the people, because as Speaker, most of the other leaders, all the other leaders, were essentially men who could be... How do I say it nicely? Anyway, we'll just skip over that. So, you had to stick to your guns. You had to stick to your guns and be tough and say, this is what we're going to do. After all, at that point, I was representing my caucus and everyone in it, and you can't give up to someone else because they think they're going to be tougher than you.
Mm-hmm. Gail, you're not only in the minority as a woman, but you're in the minority as a Republican. So how does that play out in terms of how you are able to speak up in the legislature and how you present yourself?
Well, I have to tell you, I've never thought about it. I've never worried about speaking up. I don't know that women necessarily do worry about that. I think that sometimes women are averse to conflict. But in terms of being tough, in terms of speaking up for themselves, I have never thought that there was a problem. In fact, following up on both what Susan and Moira said, in terms of tuning into other people, I think that politicians often talk too much. I think they're very concerned about how they come across and get through to people, when in fact, the people whom you are representing or seeking to represent are far more concerned about whether they get through to you. Mm-hmm. And so the most important thing, at least when you're dealing with your constituents, is listening to them and making sure that they understand that you understood what they said. Mm-hmm. And then when you've done something about it, or you've tried to do something about it, you can come back and tell them. But in terms of dealing with the people in the legislature, whether they're in the majority or in the minority, I found myself once a senior vice president of the 7th largest French company, and I was on the executive committee with 13 engineers, all French, who had all been through the French government engineering school and were all quite high up in their respective categories. And I never thought about it. So I don't see how this is much different, really.
That was probably good preparation.
One of the things that Ella was known for, and I'm sure you're aware of this, she went out every month to a town or city in this state and had office hours. And anyone could visit her. She also did that in her governor's office on the Monday, I think it was the first Monday of the month. And staff, we would be there till 9 or 10 o'clock at night until she saw that last person. And I remember distinctly a senior citizen came all the way in by bus from Torrington one day to ask her to see to it that the bus route in Torrington was changed so it would come by the senior citizen center. So when you're talking about listening to people, which is obviously something politicians have to do, she never failed at that. And she did that when she was in Congress. She would come home and visit a town in each of the communities of the 6th District once a month. She'd be there. So it was that kind of closeness to people that I think characterized her success, too. And she was tough. You're talking about her tough. I have a lot of stories I could tell you. The first day I was on the job, and I had been told, don't buzz her. You know, you have these intercom buzzes when she had received a message, and I had a little button on the phone, and that was the button to buzz her. And I was told not to do that. I don't know why I did it. To this day, I don't know. But I was and I pushed the button. The door opened, and I knew. Of course, I knew immediately that I had committed, the worst thing going. And she said, don't ever do that. I said, I realize that. I never did it again. But I could tell you many stories about the tough side. But one thing I always say to people is she was fair. She was fair. Mm-hmm. And I think that was part of her success with people with whom she was tough. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you have to be in politics.
Susan, let's talk a little bit about, since we're here in this never-ending winter, about that big snowstorm of 78, because that seems to really have cemented Ella's image as a leader in a lot of people's minds.
I think that she set the standard for how you deal with a weather crisis, and I think that storm really personified her as the person who was hands-on. And so it was, when that snowstorm started, it was a day where the snow started falling very, very quickly. And there were a lot of people who ended up being trapped in their cars because there was so much snow falling that the public works folks couldn't get it away fast enough. So there she was. She was coming in from a meeting. I think she was on Asylum Avenue or Farmington Avenue, coming into Hartford. And she's with the state trooper. And there are people looking around. The cars have stopped because there's so much snow. She's getting very impatient because she wants to get to the Capitol and start dealing with this. And so she just gets out of the car, leaves the trooper with the car, and starts walking through the snow toward the Capitol. That was Ella. Meanwhile, people in the cars are realizing, hey, that's the governor, and she's got her boots on and she's trudging. And she went to the armory and never left. But one of the things that was also the hallmark of her leadership was that she wanted to be all around the state. She wanted to see what people were going through. So she got in the helicopter, and there was a very poignant moment where somebody in Norwich had stamped in a big field, "Help Ella," so that she could see. But a lot of people remember her then. And I should say that going into that storm, she was at a lower point in her popularity because when she took over as governor, she inherited a really big deficit. That's what was the legacy that Governor Maskell had left her with. And she was a very frugal person. She had to make some tough decisions. The state employees unions weren't very happy with her because she shortened the work week because the state was having difficulty affording lots of different things. And I think that storm re-solidified her popularity with people in Connecticut.
Does any of that sound familiar to anybody in recent history? Yeah. Would you like to ask a question? Certainly. Just let us bring the microphone over to you if you don't mind.
When the governor, now I've forgotten his name, when he closed the roads, I thought
The current governor?
The current governor. Malloy.
Okay.
I thought he was able to do this because Ella did it back in 78. She set the standard. So if she can do it, anybody can do it after that. And I bet you the decision was easier because of that.
Do you think so, John?
Oh, yes. And interestingly, and it's in the book, I've documented this, there was a little article in the American Public Health Journal talking about that storm, comparing the states of New England and what they did in 1978, which was a tremendous blizzard. And by closing the roads, we had less than a half dozen fatalities in Connecticut, which sadly was too many. But this article compared it to Massachusetts, which lost 27 people to fatalities on the highways. So looking back, I mean, I was amazed that this little article would appear in my view, comparing, the statistics on deaths from road accidents. So that's another feather in her cap that she did it and provided safety. And that's true. All governors have been doing it since.
Mm-hmm. Susan, you sent me a couple of quotes of Ellis that you really love. I'll let you share a couple of those because I hadn't heard some of these before.
One of my favorite ones is when she said, in Connecticut, I'm just an old shoe. And she said that after there was a lot of hoopla in 1974. She had been elected as the first lady governor not to follow her husband into office. And so her picture was on the cover of every major national magazine, Newsweek, Time, and she didn't, some of the attention, I think, took her aback. And she said, I'm just an old shoe. And I think what she meant by that was she was just a regular person. And what she liked about government was just to be able to go to those office hours and meet with her constituents and deal with people's problems one at a time and the state's problems one at a time. And also, I think she was referring to the fact that she wasn't like a Gloria Schaefer, who was Secretary of the State when she was in government and was very glamorous. Ella Grasso was the farthest from glamorous. She would be walking around in polyester pantsuits, often sneakers. You'd notice that there would be a button missing from her coat, and it didn't matter to her. And I think that made people around her very comfortable, and nobody ever felt intimidated about going to Governor Grasso and asking for her help. And I think that's why when she passed away from cancer, there's a famous picture of thousands of people lined up in the rain outside of the state capitol building to pay their last respects.
Mm-hmm. I think that was part of her success, though. People didn't expect her to come out looking glamorous. She wasn't glamorous. She used to say to me, make the appointment at the hairdresser's for me. I have this obligation coming up and I want to look good. She said, I don't know why I go, because I came out looking the same.
Well, I do remember reading one time about, I think, a gown that she wore to probably her inaugural ball, which someone described as looking like an oversized floor-length football jersey.
Oh, is that what that might be the dress that Vice Clemmo, who was a writer at the Hartford Courant, said that he was going to make for her. He said that, if she won, he was going to sew her inaugural dress. And of course, Ella, number one, didn't care and didn't want him to feel bad. But apparently, it had a lot of wavy seams and it wasn't particularly stylish, was it, John?
It struck me that, her authenticity is something that we talk about a lot these days about politicians and others having that sense of authenticity, that who they really are. And it strikes me that she certainly did that. Moira, I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because I think people in Connecticut, maybe because we're small and because people feel close to their government, I think people are really looking for that.
Well, I think people look for that in any profession. If you're wherever you are, if you're working somewhere, my belief is authenticity is being honest. If there's an issue in front of you and it's something you really can't support, I'd rather ask your opinion, but tell you that versus saying, well, I'll consider it or maybe I'll look at it. And I think it's not just authenticity. To me, it's gaining people's respect. I think it's very important, and you're authentic by telling people the truth, by, as Gail said, by listening to them clearly and asking their opinion, and if possible, in the end, incorporating some of their concerns into the solution that you have. But telling them, I really can't do all that you want. I can go this far or I can't do it. Because you give people a false sense of government that it can do all and everything, and it can't. So be honest, and I believe that people will respect you.
And she used to say a lot of my bills were really bad ideas.
You can never get away with pretending to be someone who you are not. And I think another specialty, since I was elaborating on that before, of politicians is often being disingenuous. They have a public face, and then they have another face that they show to people whom they know well. And that's so easy to spot. Mm-hmm. And people don't like it when they see it, and they see it all the time. They would rather see who you are. And I read an article probably about a year ago by David Brooks, actually. And he was talking about a number of things, and he referred to something he called the power of the particular. And when he did that, he said, if politicians and others in the public eye would simply accept who they are and be the authentic people that they are, they will come. People will come. Because you can't pretend to be frumpy. Nobody could pretend to be the way that Ella Grasso portrayed herself, and nobody could pretend to be glamorous. That's pretty hard to do, too. You've got to be who you are. And people will appreciate that more than you're being someone that maybe they project onto you and want you to be.
Yeah. If anyone has any questions, please do raise your hand, and I'll try to call on you. I'll bring the microphone over. Yeah, just let's bring the microphone up to you if you don't mind. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry for coming late. I don't know if this has been raised at all yet, but I recall that Jimmy Carter's nomination came in 1980. And around that time, there was another female governor not elected after her husband out in Washington State, if I recall right. And there was talk, like there is now, about VP nominees, and Ella was rumored to be on the short list. Does anybody know about that?
Is that so?
Well, I ventured one day to pick up the phone and called Walter Mondale. He ran in 1984. And we had a very nice teleconference on the phone. And, of course, in the back of my mind was to ask a question that would reflect what you're referring to. You're referring to the 80 election, but I'm jumping ahead to 84. This is the one I know about. And I said, did you ever think about, and would you have considered, Ella, for running with you as your running mate in 1984? And there was a pause, and he said yes. And I will tell you 3 reasons why. 1, she had experience at the local, state, and national levels. Secondly, she was Italian. And he felt that the Democratic Party had lost the Italian constituency in the country, and he wanted to bring it back. And thirdly, he said she can raise money around the country, or she could have raised money. Well, when you think of what he did do, he chose an Italian woman to run with him. Now, I don't think it would have changed that election in 1984, and even having Ella on the ticket probably wouldn't have changed it. But it was something that I had to ask, because so many people have speculated about that. Now, referring to 1980, one person told me that I should speak to someone who recalled that Ella was called to a telephone at Bradley Airport, and the call was from the president, Jimmy Carter. Or he was running at that point, I guess, for re-election. And she was asked, would she accept the nomination. Well, he already had a vice president, and I don't think he was about to drop Mondale. I mean, rumors like that float around in stories people want to tell you, and, you know, some are accurate, some are not. But I thought the answer from Walter Mondale about the 84 election was pretty significant.
And Susan, that interesting point that John brings up, because Ella not only inspired women to get into politics, but also Italian Americans.
Absolutely, and people of all backgrounds. It's interesting if you look at the legacy of women in politics in Connecticut. You know, as a matter of fact, when I was serving as Secretary of the State, 4 of the 6 people in elective office were women, and we used to joke that, you know, Dick Blumenthal and Mike Fedeli were honorary women. And if you were to look at that picture of the 4 of us in statewide office, I think a lot of us were there having been inspired by Ella Grasso. But I've had Italian-American politicians in Connecticut who were men, say that Ella inspired them and made them believe that they could do it, that there weren't ethnic stereotypes out there that would prevent them from succeeding. I've heard from Republicans that she inspired them because she was so no-nonsense about state government. So I think her legacy is a very broad one. She touched so many people and inspired so many different kinds of people to seek out public service.
And that's interesting, John, because she certainly felt at odds in her early life with many of the people that she met in her early education who were Yankees, WASPs. She was sort of the odd woman out.
She was, and her son tells the story, Jimmy tells the story that his mother had, 3 skirts, 2 blouses, and 2 sweaters. And that's all she could wear, because that's all she could afford. And she used to ask her mother, "Can't I have this, that, the other thing?" And the mother said, "No, because you can't afford it." And she was in that Mount Holyoke environment, which was certainly waspish. And interestingly, she was the babysitter for the Giamatti family. Bart
so
Giamatti's,
she babysat Bart Giamatti?
Well, yes. Professor Giamatti was on the faculty at Mount Holyoke, and his son Bart. Yeah.
Right.
And it was interesting, Ella was governor when Bart became president of the University of Yale. So Italians had emerged. Yeah. And, that was one of the things Bailey liked about her. She represented what he said was the rising group in Connecticut in terms of the demographics, Italians. Mm-hmm. And he latched onto her as one that would bring the Italian vote to the Democratic side. He was right.
And she did make an effort, when she would go out campaigning. One of the things that she did, for instance, when she came to my hometown of Middletown, she would go to the Carmela coat factory where there were Italian immigrant women who were working, and she'd speak Italian, and she would make sure that she spoke to every janitor at the state capitol. She was remarkable like that.
Moira, how much do ethnic politics still play into what goes on in state government?
I think there's still a recognition that, from my perspective anyway, that people, if you don't know the politician, if you're, haven't been, that you tend to look at the ethnic background, that there's still, even in, I'm from Stamford, Connecticut, and to the point about what you were saying about Italians, there is still that recognition generally when we look at campaigns that this person, they'll probably be that this is an Italian running, so they will get a lot of Italian votes, or Irish person running, getting, be it whatever. They are still, campaigns are still centered a bit around that concept. With the social media and the explosion that's occurred in that, I think it diminishes somewhat because people have a greater ability to get to know the individual, to get to know their positions, to see them more as a representing, yes, it is a political position versus, I'm Irish, versus an Irish position. You tend now to, a little bit more than certainly way long time ago, their political position, not just their ethnic background.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask our panelists or ask our author today? Okay, let's get the microphone over here.
It's a long time since I've heard about her, and I would like to know a little bit about her family background. If she was married, how many children she had, and what she had to deal with while she was governor. Thank you.
John?
Well, her husband, Tom Grasso, was from East Hartford, and they married in 1942. It was, from what I could see and observe, a respectful, happy, loving marriage. They had 2 children. Both are alive, both living in Connecticut. Jim lives in the eastern part of Connecticut, and he works for the Department of Children and Families. And Suzanne lives in New Haven and is a therapist. Ladies would know more about, is it Reiki? Reiki. Therapist. And both have certainly cooperated with me in every way. And Jim has 1 son, and they're very happy and doing well.
I had a bill that I was supporting at the state legislature, and it was on advanced health care directives. And because at this point, Suzanne Grasso, Ella Grasso's daughter, worked at a hospice in Branford, she came to testify. Mm-hmm. Well, she was probably at that point in her late 50s, early 60s, so about the age that Ella was when she was governor. And she was about the same height, about the same weight, and she cut her hair short. So she and I were walking through the halls of the state capitol, and people were getting whiplash, looking, because they were doing double take. Oh my gosh, Ella Grasso has come back to the Capitol, spitting image of her mom now.
Very interesting. Gail, we just recently had kind of a discussion in the legislature about a male legislator who made a remark that some people, at a public hearing, that some people considered to be insensitive to women or somewhat vulgar. And there's been a whole discussion now over what ought to happen and, whether there should be action taken. The speaker did take some action against him. Is there an environment that is in any way hostile toward women in the legislature or in the other halls of the Capitol, or was that just an aberrant, something that just happened?
I have to tell you that I have never found that there was. And throughout my whole corporate career, sometimes I would hear people say that they found wherever the company I was working to be that way, to be hostile to women, and sometimes they didn't. I think it depends sometimes on the perspective of the individual. Mm-hmm. But I know that some of the discourse that we've heard recently, in the last 2-3 years, has been, there's been a lot of focus on civility in politics. And I have never found our General Assembly to be an uncivil place. Sometimes there is conflict in positions, and there's always 1 or 2 individuals who might be rude. But mostly I find it a very cordial place. And in addition, we have protocol in place to make sure that when we are on the floor, when we are in committee, that the way we speak to each other or through the chair or through the speaker ensures that civility and people respect it. So I have never felt uncomfortable at all. I think it all depends on the individual.
Moira, how did it strike you when you were coming in that freshman term and as you came up through the ranks?
I would agree with that. I've never... as I shared with all of you, I was intimidated when I first came in just because I didn't know the process, not because I was a female. I just felt overwhelmed. But once learning the rules and the procedures and how you do it, I think everyone, from my perspective, you may disagree with someone, but there's a real... there's kind of a rule that you should treat people with respect. You may disagree with what they're saying on the floor, but I was the speaker, so I controlled the floor. You're not going to tolerate someone speaking on the floor disrespectfully to another individual who happened to have a different opinion. And I'm going to say I contrast that clearly with what's currently going on in Washington, because I think what's going on in Washington is astonishing. And there is a lack of civility there, where in Connecticut, and if any of you have an opportunity to go over to the legislature when they're debating, you will see that who's ever in the chair, meaning the speaker or assistant speaker, will make sure that nothing happens. And if they for some reason do, you're asked to rephrase it. You're told that you can't handle it that way. You're not going to be allowed to continue. So there is a real strict rule, and I think everyone understands that.
Mm-hmm. Susan, I want to just switch gears for a minute, and we're getting near the end of our time here, but I'm wondering what motivated Ella to leave Congress, because if we haven't outlined her career, we should, but what motivated her to leave Congress to then run for governor?
You know, I think two things. She said at the time that you don't make a long career in Congress if you're 50 when you get there. But I have to say, there are a lot of people in Congress who are way older than that, so they clearly have had some good careers. But I think Ella was an executive personality. She went to Congress, did very, very well in Congress, particularly in constituent service. But I think she went there knowing that there was this other office that she much more aspired to do, and that was to be governor. And she liked being governor in Connecticut because she could make a difference for so many more people, and you didn't have to deal with, you know, more than 400 other Congress members to make something happen.
Mm-hmm. Do we have one more question that anyone would like to ask to our panel? Yes, let's bring the microphone right over here, Paul, if you would.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just on the subject you were just discussing, I'm curious, did Ella ever say anything about how she felt about the terms of people in Congress? Did she have any opinion on that? You know,
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
If you can imagine Bella Abzug and Ella Grasso leading a charge for reforms in the House of Representatives back in 1971. They were both on a sort of an ad hoc group that was pressuring the males to change the laws of the Congress, how it operated. And in those days, you know, you had to be there for years before you rose up to become a committee chairman. And they looked at each other and they said, this is going to be a real, you know, long-time battle before we ever rise. There was one lady there, Lenore Sullivan from Missouri, who had been in the Congress 22 years, and she was still in the rank and file on the committee. And they pushed a reform. So they went to the leadership and demanded that, you know, changes be made. Stonewalled. And so Ella decided, well, I'll do my best to do what I think I can get support for in terms of legislative bills that I want to propose. They were, you know, kept at arm's length. There was no hope there. And I think that in some ways she realized, as Susan said, it would be decades before she would ever rise to power. She'd had power here. Secretary of State. Susan can, you know, affirm that. And I think she always had her sights set on being governor. She wanted to be governor in 1970, and it wasn't going to happen. Bailey advised her not to primary the Congressman D'Addario from Hartford, who, by the way, was the first Italian-American to run for governor, and lost badly. And Ella, I think, said, "Oof, could have happened to me," you know. So she went to Washington realizing, I think it was going to be short, that she really had her sights set on the governorship. I'll tell you really one quick story. Someone said to me, you know, I remember being in the governor's residence with Ella when she had her children there. And so this must have been when she was Secretary of State. The children were young. And she said to the children, Ella whispered to the children, someday, we're going to be living here. I didn't put it in the book because, you know, Could have been an apocryphal story, a fantasy, but it's a good story.
It's a great story. Susan, I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about, you had a memento actually in your office that was very closely tied to Ella Grasso. You talk about it in the beginning of your book.
Oh my goodness!
On the table, I think.
Oh,
yes.
So there were a couple of really cool things about being Secretary of the State, and one was that the parking space was right in front of the state capitol. So every morning when I went to work, I got to walk under the statue of Ella Grasso, which is on the second floor of the state capitol. And by the way, ladies, only female statue along the face of the Capitol. And there still are some empty spots, so you never know. So anyway, so that was one fun thing. The other fun thing was coming into my office, there was a desk that had been there for years, so I got to sit at the desk that used to be used by Ella Grasso. And also walking under that statue, when I had announced my campaign for Secretary of the State, I wanted to announce under her statue, because she was Secretary of the State, she was a state rep like I was before that. And so this poor guy from my hometown newspaper, the Middletown Press, had to lie down to take the picture of me, short little me, standing there with Ella Grasso on the second floor. But anyway, the other fun thing that someone pointed out to me in the Secretary of the State's office, and it's still there, there is a very beautiful, very sturdy Victorian table that I guess was made at the time the Capitol was built in the 1870s. And Barbara Kennelly, who was Secretary of the State when Ella Grasso passed away, told me that the governor put her in charge of the funeral proceedings at the Capitol for the governor. And so they were wondering what they were going to use when her coffin came to the state capitol so they could put her body in state and allow people to pay their respects. And so this was the table that was used for that purpose, and it's still in the Secretary of the State's office, and it was pulled out into the Hall of the Flags where people, thousands and thousands of people filed past, and there's a little plaque on the bottom that says, this is the table that was used for that purpose. So when I had fourth graders come to the Capitol, I always used to talk about Ella Grasso and have them read that little plaque about Ella.
It's really kind of extraordinary. We have to wrap up, but I'd just like to give each of you, and Moira, I'll start with you, just about 30 seconds to kind of pull together your thoughts from today. And, it is Women's History Month, and here we're honoring this first woman governor.
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that you did it, because I think it's important to show how valuable women can be to the process. I happen to believe that women are particularly suited to be in the political process because they tend, and this is not a negative at all to men, because we all have our different styles, but women do their due diligence. They pay attention to the smallest detail, which in legislation can, if you don't, can change the whole concept of the bill. A small little line in a 200 line bill can change the whole concept. So I'm very glad that you took the time to do this, particularly at a time, and I'm sure we've all been aware recently of the CEO and the book that came out, talking about, women getting to be leaders. I mean, clearly she's a leader. Yes, she's a leader in her own company. The importance of having us and the importance of really being there and believing in yourself. And that's what's true, I think, in any profession, that everybody can do it. And I would encourage, I think it's very important to have all voices represented, and we really do need more women in government. I think it's absolutely critical.
Moira, thank you. John?
Well, people said to me, why are you writing a book about a woman? Can men write a biography of a woman? And I said, well, who else better to do it than someone who worked with this lady day in and day out? And I felt then, and I still feel very strongly now, that we need to speaking as an historian, we need to uncover stories about women and the achievements and success stories that can prove to be role models for the young people coming along. So if my book does nothing else, I hope it appeals to young people to know a little bit more about this first woman. Remember, being first in any profession is tough. It's a difficult position. But she did it. She did it well. And I'm delighted that, I contributed to women's history in Connecticut, which I think needs a lot of attention. Thank you.
Gail?
Well, first I just have to say that it's really been a privilege to be part of a panel of such accomplished people, and I congratulate John on his book, and Moira and Susan, who've achieved so much. I think that Ella Grasso is probably the best proof we have that, if you want to do something, just do it. I don't think there's anything else holding women back in politics. My experience, and I may be wrong, tells me that that women don't tend to seek conflict as much and feed conflict as much as they tend to want to diffuse it and resolve things. And that's been my experience. So they tend to like to work together if it's possible. And of course, that's what we need so much more of in politics. That's when we do our best work. So I think it's just a question of people deciding to do it. And if they want it badly enough and work hard enough, they'll succeed.
Susan, I'll let you have the last word.
Oh, my goodness. Ella Grasso was smart, she was tough, she was compassionate, and she loved people, she loved helping people, and I think that's why she was successful. And I think she also had a legacy that goes beyond politics, and I'll just give you a quick story. I always say that women in politics help women in business and vice versa. So Ella Grasso was Secretary of the State, and she needed an assistant. So she called the Mount Holyoke alumni office and said, I need a secretary, and I need someone who is a graduate of Mount Holyoke. And so they gave her a name of one Eileen Krause, who was recently married, had moved to Hartford to live with her husband, and she had told her husband that she wouldn't work, that she was going to stay home and take care of the house. And she'd been married a couple of weeks, and she gets this call from Ella Grasso, and Ella Grasso said, young lady, can you come to my office right away? I need an assistant. And so Eileen dutifully goes over. She didn't even know who Ella Grasso was, but she figured it out. She went to the state capitol and agreed to be her personal secretary. And then after she agreed on the spot to take the job, she then realized she had to go home to her husband and say, honey, remember how I said I wasn't going to work? Well, I have this job with Ella Grasso. And this is the lady who became the president of Fleet Bank, who had the corner office in that building right across the street.
And as I recall, she was a first herself. I think, I don't remember the exact details, but I know that being the president and being a woman, I believe that she was the first, and that's quite a good story. There are many more really great stories about Ella Grasso. If you would like to get a copy of the book, John did bring some today, and I want to thank all of you for being here. It's been a most extraordinary experience having the opportunity to talk about Ella Grasso and her influence with all of you. Thank you so much. This program will be seen on CPN.